Hornet Heaven, Series 1, Episode 4. Acceptable in the 80s. Earth Season 1980-81. In the Supporters Club bar on the morning of Sunday, September the 7th, 1980, Henry Grover leaned forward and propped his empty pipe against the rim of a brown and beige Watney Special ashtray. Henry enjoyed sitting here. The decor delighted him. When he'd founded Watford Rovers almost a century earlier in 1881, there had been nothing quite like these chrome bar stools covered in purple vinyl, nor this wallpaper with its stylish orange and mustard circles. The 1980s had only just begun, Henry reflected, but already they looked like being a decade of quite superb sophistication. Henry looked up as Derek Garston popped his head around the door. Even though Derek had been in Hornet Heaven for 59 years, the fresh-faced 13-year-old seemed unsure whether he was old enough to be allowed in a bar.
"Sorry to bother you, sir, but we've got a bit of a problem,"
the boy said in a shaky voice.
"There's a hooligan in Hornet Heaven."
Henry climbed the stairs from the bowels of the bar up to the potholed tarmac of Occupation Road. At the age of 83, he had to cling tightly to the handrail. Young Derek was behind him. "Did the hooligan ask for me specifically?" the father of the club asked.
"Yes, sir,"
Derek replied with youthful innocence.
"He said he wanted to know who the firm's top boy is."
Henry didn't know much about hooliganism. When violence had first broken out on the Watford terraces in the early 1970s, he'd preferred to stay focused on footballing matters on the pitch. He'd found the violence of Duncan Wellborn's tackling a much better watch. He asked Derek, "The new fellow didn't look a dangerous sort, did he?" He heard the boy's footsteps disappearing back down the stairs. Derek called out,
"I'll catch up with you later, sir."
A skinhead, known to his crew as Lamper, was waiting by the creosoted programme shed on Occupation Road. He fingered his ear stud, nervously. Occupation Road was well known as a useful bottleneck for trapping Watford fans when things kicked off after a game. He also knew his Farrah slacks and Lacoste polo shirt would mark him out as a prime target for a hit if any of the other mobs were in town. He hoped someone was scouting the main road, keeping an eye out for West Ham's intercity firm or Millwall's F Troop. There were scores to be settled. There always were. It was what made being a football fan so brilliant. He saw a doddery old geezer hobbling towards him. For a top boy, the fella didn't look as if he'd be much use when things got tasty. Lamper grinned as he realised he'd be able to install himself as the new top boy with only a small amount of brutal violence. "Hello," the old geezer said heartily. He introduced himself. "Welcome to Hornet Heaven. Have you had your induction?" "I know the school, mate," Lamper replied. "But where's the crew? You know, the hardcore. I ain't even seen any Klingons. No one here looks a decent scrapper. It'll be dead meat if the headhunters are round the corner or the steamers." Henry Grover looked totally confused. Lamper laughed. This was going to be a walk in the park. He could take charge of the Hornet Heaven firm any time he liked. He blanked Henry and went inside the creosoted shed. He came out with a programme from the previous season, the home game against Luton Town, on December the 26th, 1979. He'd enjoyed the knock at that one. Now he could go and enjoy it again. He strutted towards the ancient turnstile and bellowed with his arms out wide. "And we will fight forevermore because of Boxing Day!" Just before he went through the turnstile, he glanced back at Henry. The top boy looked worried, as well he might. Lamper shouted, "I'd watch your back if I were you, mate!" Henry stood on the cracked tarmac of Occupation Road with mixed emotions. The new arrival had been yobbish, but his trousering had been impressively smart in a stylishly casual way. Young Derek appeared again from the entrance to the bar.
"If there's going to be trouble, sir, I know just the man we need."
"Really? Who's that?" Henry asked.
"Frank Barson, sir. A real hard man. He got a 6-month ban for kicking an opponent in our 6-2 home defeat to Fulham in September 1928.
Henry didn't need Derek's statistical pedantry to know Frank Barson's credentials. Won the FA Cup with Aston Villa in 1920. 10 career dismissals. Once knocked a referee unconscious. Best friends with convicted murderers. Went to a contract negotiation armed with a gun. Henry shuddered. "He only made 10 appearances for us, and he only ran the King William IV pub on Watford High Street for a short while. He's not here in Hornet Heaven. Actually, I'm not sure he'll be in any heaven, unless Aston Villa have a Villa Valhalla for old warriors."
"There must be others up here who could help, sir,"
Derek said. Then, on hearing the clank of someone exiting the rickety ancient turnstile, he scarpered back down the stairs. But it wasn't Lamper. Instead, it was a fan who'd arrived in Hornet Heaven a few years ago, wearing high-waster baggies and platform shoes. Henry went over to the fan, shook his hand, and praised the finery of his garments. Then he went back to pondering what to do about the hooligan. He quickly decided Derek was right. There were other people in Hornet Heaven who could help. He said to himself, "This is a job for Johnny Allgood." At the Boxing Day game, Lamper stood under the scoreboard with the hardcore Watford lads on the Vicarage Road terrace. He tried to lead the singing.
"Who are ya?"
he yelled, pointing at the Luton fans.
"Who are ya?"
But none of the crowd joined in. He pushed the bloke next to him.
"Come on, mate,"
he shouted.
"Sing up."
His hands went through the guy, like he was a ghost. The guy didn't react at all. Lamper turned and shoved another bloke. The same thing happened. He walked down the terrace, passing through dozens of other fans. None of them noticed. This was no good. He walked up to and straight through a policeman. He went and stood in front of the Luton fans with his palms up. He beckoned them on.
"Come on then. Who wants some?"
No one wanted any. No one even noticed him. He tried to run them. None of them moved. Lamper headed for the exit. Hornet Heaven was proving no good at all. Henry was sitting with Johnny Allgood at a Formica top table in the Supporters Club bar. On the wall was a photo of the current Watford team. Henry gazed at it. No fewer than 8 men had Lothario moustaches. The players' shirts had been finished off with shiny red collars as wide as lapels. Henry couldn't envisage style as consummate as this ever going out of fashion. The 1980s style of moustache, Henry thought, made Johnny Allgood's long drooping affair seem very old-fashioned. But he didn't say anything. There was nothing anyone in Hornet Heaven could do to change their appearance. If they could, Henry reckoned, they'd all want to look like Steve Sims. The oblong of facial hair above Steve Sims' top lip had the colour and dimensions of a Mars bar. Henry thought it was superlative. He looked back at his old friend Johnny Allgood. More formally known as John Goodall, Johnny Allgood had been a nationally renowned star of the English game before he ever arrived at Watford. He'd played for the Preston North End Invincible side in 1889. He was a former England captain. Footballing royalty. Henry knew that Hornet Heaven was lucky to have Johnny, despite the fact that Johnny would have looked much more with it these days if he could only trim that moustache and set it off nicely with a paisley tank top. The two old pals looked up as Lamper stomped in.
"There's something wrong with the visuals at the match, mate,"
Lamper said to Henry.
"I couldn't get a ruck going."
Henry introduced Lamper to Johnny Allgood. Then he explained to Lamper how Hornet Heaven sat on top of Watford matches without any kind of interaction. Lamper looked disappointed.
"Never mind," Henry said. "At least you could enjoy the football." "Nah," Lamper said. "Then watch. Never do. Not interested."
Henry was stunned. If Lamper wasn't interested in football, what was he doing in Hornet Heaven? Henry turned to Johnny Allgood. Johnny Allgood looked mystified. "Don't you support Watford, then?" Johnny Allgood asked in the Scottish accent he'd got from living in Kilmarnock when he was a boy.
"Course I do,"
Lamper said. He showed Henry and Johnny some of the injuries he'd sustained in the club's name. A missing tooth, a scar slashed across his closely cropped scalp. Henry and Johnny winced.
"Watford through and through, me," Lamper said. "Loyal to the end. Literally."
"What do you mean?" Johnny Allgood asked.
"I died this afternoon when I was chasing a scummer. I leapt over some railings into the road. A car hit me. Morris Marina, I think."
Henry had never seen a Morris Marina, but he'd heard about the majesty of its design. What a magnificent way to go. He was jealous. "But what are you going to do now you're here?" Johnny asked. "There's really not much to do apart from watch football."
"Well, if I can't ruck with fans at the games, I'll have to start scraps between everyone up here," Lamper said.
Henry looked alarmed. "But we're a tight-knit lot in Hornet Heaven. We have no factions," he said. Lamper grinned.
"Factions are never hard to start,"
he said. Johnny Allgood watched Lamper go. He didn't like the thought of Hornet being set against Hornet. He'd become committed to Watford when he arrived as the club's first ever manager in 1903. In his first season, he'd led the team to promotion. Unbeaten. Invincible. Later, after he finally retired from football in 1913, he'd returned to live in Watford for the rest of his life. He'd become the groundsman at the club's Cassio Road ground. Now he stared at the sticky floor, deep in thought. "Admiring the linoleum?" Henry asked. "I'm not surprised. It's breathtaking. How could a floor covering like this ever be surpassed?" "I was thinking we need a plan to deal with the hooligan," Johnny replied. "Oh," Henry said. "Got anything up your sleeve?" Johnny had been wondering whether the situation was bad enough to require outside help. If so, he'd been thinking perhaps he ought to reveal the existence of something only he knew about, having discovered it at the bottom of the compost heap while he was groundsman at Cassio Road in the 1920s. On consideration, though, he decided to leave the revelation for another time. "Come on, Johnny. You're a great leader of men," Henry said. "You made us invincible once before. We can't let a hooligan beat us now. What should we do?" Johnny stroked the tendrils of his drooping moustache. He pondered. As one of football's greatest early players, when there had been little sophistication to the sport, Johnny Allgood had been a thoughtful and inventive inside forward. It was what had made him a Goliath of the game, more significant in his era than Stanley Matthews or David Beckham in more modern eras. He had a shrewd brain. Now, after a couple of minutes' thought, Watford's brilliant first manager began outlining his tactics to the father of the club. Lamper had gone back to his favourite game ever. It was the home game against West Ham United that had taken place a year earlier on September the 1st, 1979. He stood on the Vicarage Road terrace. Everywhere he looked, fights were breaking out. It was quality. He followed a group of 5 Hammers fans. They were roaming the terrace, picking on random Watford fans and handing out spankings. This was how to do it. The old Bill were turning a blind eye. The hooligans had a free run. Lamper had rounded up a group of Hornet Heaven residents and brought them along. They were all wearing Edwardian suits. They'd been fans of the original Watford Rovers in the 1880s. Lamper wanted to teach them the basics of casual violence.
"Watch and learn,"
He snarled at them.
"You steam in, you smack a few people about, then you leg it."
The men in Edwardian suits didn't look as if this was their kind of thing.
"Come on,"
Lamper shouted at them.
"watch how these West Ham yobs do it. Then you'll have a bit about you when the Barney starts between you lot, the Watford Rovers posse, and those West Harts Muppets." "But we don't hate the West Harts chaps anymore," an Edwardian protested. "Yes, there was a dispute over the name when the two clubs came together, but it's over. It finished 82 years ago when everyone cordially agreed to become Watford Football Club." "Shut it, you pussy,"
Lamper said.
"They made you call yourself West Harts for 5 whole seasons. You should never have stood for it. You need to show 'em who's really been boss all along." "We did argue. Quite a bit,"
Another Edwardian said, trying to sound tough but giving up.
"Happily, it all ended in 1898 with a mutually acceptable solution."
Lamper swore at the man.
"You surrendered. What you should have done is take out their top boy. Luckily, it's never too late to make amends and settle the score."
a group of the West Ham casuals jogged past on their way to menace some more Watford fans in the real world. Lamper watched his pupils recoil. The Edwardian firm were pathetic. Clearly, he couldn't rely on the old Watford Rovers and West Arts rivalry to cause a proper ruction in Hornet heaven. He decided he needed a new plan. He needed to find something Watford fans could properly divide over. The colour of the team's shorts or something. He lamped one of the Edwardians and left the stadium. Lamper sat on the gravel on Occupation Road. He was hacked off. He couldn't seem to get anyone in Hornet heaven riled up. After the West Ham game, he'd gone to yesterday's match at Shrewsbury. It had been dismal. Not a single punch-up. With a few minutes to go, he climbed up on top of the fence at the front of the away end. He turned to the Watford fans from the real world. He'd shouted at them to invade the pitch because Watford were losing. No one had noticed him. In the end, he'd invaded the pitch by himself. But the game had just continued around him. He'd felt embarrassed. A lonely and isolated figure. Just like Malcolm Poskett perched out on the wing. Now he heard footsteps and looked up. He saw the bald geezer with the drooping moustache, Johnny Allgood. A beefy, dark-skinned geezer too. Johnny Allgood introduced his friend. "This is Jack Cother," he said. "Darky to my mates," Jack Cother said. "Darky played fullback for me in 1904-05, Johnny Allgood said. "He's quite, what's the word? Handy. So don't try anything." Both men were in their 70s. Lamper knew he could easily show them who was boss. They probably wouldn't even fight back, which meant there was no point in dishing it out in the first place. That was the whole problem. No one in Hornet heaven was interested in a decent bit of knuckle. Lamper felt despondent. Some people back on Earth had started claiming hooliganism wasn't anything to do with football. Maybe they'd been right after all. It was looking like he was definitely in the wrong place. "We come in peace," Johnny Allgood said. "Hornet heaven is a homely spot. We welcome everyone, and we like to make sure everyone fits in. Why don't we show you around? I'm sure you'll find something you enjoy." Lamper shrugged. There sure as hell wasn't anything else to do. The next day, Henry Grover sat opposite Johnny Allgood and Darky Cother in the supporters' club bar. For a moment, Henry was distracted by a beer mat advertising something called Skoll. He thought the beverage looked the absolute height of deliciousness. "So, how did your tour with the hooligan go?" Henry asked. "We took him to all the great Watford occasions," Johnny reported. "Our first game in the Football League in August 1920. Our first promotion in 1959-60. Graham Taylor's first game in charge. He just wasn't interested." "Oh, dear. Perhaps you should have concentrated on games of football that was simply amazing. No one can ever resist those," Henry said. "We did," Johnny said. We took him to a 7-4 win over Swindon in 1934. Not a flicker of interest.
What about last week's match? Henry asked. Surely you took him to that. The 7-1 against Southampton. Johnny nodded. We took him there too. And? Henry asked, hopefully.
He said he was bored,
Johnny reported.
Henry sucked thoughtfully on his empty pipe. On the floor, under the next table, he spotted an empty packet of Smith's crisps, pickled onion flavour. The cellophane packaging was luminous green. Yet another example, Henry reflected, of the new decade's supreme stylishness. It delighted him. And it made him wish Lamper had the same appreciation. The hooligan badly needed something that would make him happy in Hornet heaven.
I don't suppose he explained what it is he enjoys about being a hooligan? Henry asked Johnny.
Johnny answered, he talked about the moment when it's all about to kick off. He described it as half terror, half ecstasy.
I know what he means. From when I was a fullback, Darky Cother said. I loved the rush of adrenaline when I was going into a 50-50 tackle, and we both knew we were going to go over the top of the ball.
Johnny Allgood looked slightly shocked. As a skillful, sophisticated inside forward, he'd captained his country. It was as if he'd just learned a dark secret that had been kept from him until now.
Henry, who'd been an amateur fullback in his playing days, coughed and said with a sly wink, No idea what you're talking about, Darky.
When Johnny seemed to have recovered, Henry said,
Well, Hornet heaven can't offer quite that kind of buzz. We're mere spectators. So is there really nothing for our poor hooligan here?
Actually, Johnny said, I have had one idea.
Excellent. What's that? Henry asked.
Well, it seemed to me, listening to Lamper talk, that hooliganism is all about status, having a reputation as a thug, proving it, keeping it.
That sounds a bit too insightful for the likes of me, Henry said. But go on.
Well, Johnny continued, Lamper mentioned how he likes to show people who's boss. Let them know he's better than them.
Henry nodded. I know the kind of person, he said.
So what's your idea? Johnny got up and went to the cupboard on the far side of the bar. He brought something back and handed it to Henry. Henry smiled and folded it into his jacket pocket. Lamper was sitting despondently on the gravel on Occupation Road again as Henry approached him. Henry kept his hand in his pocket.
Look, old chap, Henry said, we've had an idea for how we can keep you happy in heaven. Eternity's a long old time, you know.
Lamper nodded but didn't look up.
The thing is, Lamper, we can't have violence here. But I've thought of a way you can show people who's boss.
Lamper's ears seemed to prick up a little at this.
You know, let them know you're superior.
Lamper finally looked up. Henry pulled his hand from his pocket. He unfolded a yellow bib. It had the word steward on the back. Lamper's eyes lit up. Then they moistened. Someone had finally understood him as a person. He and stewarding were a match made in heaven. In the Supporters Club bar, Henry Grover straightened the embassy-branded flights on his darts. Johnny Allgood stood with his feet carefully positioned behind the oche. Henry said, "I still can't believe just how sophisticated 1980 is turning out to be." Johnny nodded. Eric Steele's hair. Incredible chic. This new decade has such a cool vibe, Henry said. When I see Ian Bolton in those skimpy red shorts, I realise we're entering an epoch of timeless class and style. I'm sure we'll find that the ugliness of hooliganism is just a short-term aberration. Well, we've certainly got rid of it up here, Johnny said. Lamper's very happy showing the new arrivals he's in charge. Henry agreed. We run a good ship, if I may say so myself. More than that, we set a great example, Johnny said, and threw his dart. It missed the board and pierced the buxom lady in the tiny bikini on the Big D Peanuts display unit. Henry nodded proudly. We'll always stay classy in Hornet Heaven. End of episode 4. The next story from Hornet Heaven will be series 2, episode 1, The Family Club. Hornet Heaven was created and written by Watford fan Ollie Wicken. It was read by Watford fan Colin Mace. It was produced by Watford fan John Mooney. Music by Watford fans Steve Joy and Jeff Wicken.